Sherlock Holmes and the Riddle of the Seven Candles, Chapter 1. It was an evening of peculiar stillness when the case first presented itself. The air in London had a weight to it, not merely from the ever-present fog rolling over the cobblestone streets, but from an unspoken unease that one only recognized in hindsight. I recall that Holmes was in an unusually introspective mood, seated in his armchair at 221B Baker Street, fingers pressed together in that characteristic manner of his. The gas lamp flickered, casting sharp shadows along the walls, and in that dim glow he seemed less a man and more a calculating machine, waiting for the next intellectual challenge to unfold before him. We had not long been settled when Mrs. Hudson ushered in Inspector Lestrade, his brow furrowed in visible frustration. He held his bowler hat in one hand and a thin folder in the other. "I'd like your opinion on a most confounding case, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade announced without preamble. Holmes gave a languid gesture. "And what, pray, makes this case more perplexing than your usual entanglements, my dear Lestrade?" Lestrade hesitated. "Because, Mr. Holmes, I am not certain that a crime has been committed at all." Holmes raised an eyebrow, intrigued. A novel predicament indeed. "Proceed." Lestrade set the folder upon the table and extracted a single photograph. It was an old tintype, depicting a man in his 40s with a sharp nose, receding hairline, and deep-set eyes. "This is Henry Gifford," Lestrade said, "or at least it was." Holmes glanced at the image and then back at Lestrade. An odd turn of phrase. Lestrade exhaled. "Because Henry Gifford does not exist." Watson frowned. "Come now, Lestrade, surely you are mistaken. A man cannot simply cease to exist." Lestrade's lips pressed into a tight line. "That's what I thought, Doctor. But every record of his existence has disappeared. No birth certificate, no census entry, no employment history. The house he owned in Kensington, gone, as though it were never there. His own wife swears she's never heard of him. And yet, he tapped the photograph. There he is." Holmes leaned forward, eyes gleaming with that unmistakable sharpness that appeared when a puzzle engaged him fully. "And where did you obtain this photograph?" "A servant from the Gifford household smuggled it out before the house." "Vanished," Lestrade replied, voice low. "She swore upon her life that she served the Giffords for nearly 10 years. And yet, when she returned this morning, there was no house, no records, and no one to confirm her story." Holmes held the photograph up to the lamp, scrutinizing it. "And you are certain, Lestrade, that this is not a mere case of clerical error?" Lestrade's expression darkened. "I thought so too, at first. But I had Henry Gifford's name in the police register. He was under investigation for smuggling antiquities. Last night his name was there. This morning, gone. Even my written reports have been altered. My own hand, my own writing, replaced." A silence settled over the room, broken only by the distant chime of the clock tower. I swallowed, an unease creeping into my chest. "Holmes, this is absurd. There must be some rational explanation." Holmes stood abruptly, his gaze now burning with intensity. "Perhaps, Watson. But tell me this, have you ever known reality to alter itself so thoroughly?" Lestrade exhaled sharply. "I was hoping you'd tell me, Mr. Holmes, because as far as the records show, Henry Gifford never existed at all." Chapter 2. I shall never forget the look in Lestrade's eyes as he spoke those final words. A hardened officer of the law, a man who had seen the worst of London's criminal underbelly, now sat before us looking genuinely unnerved. The weight of his own statement seemed to unsettle even him. Holmes, however, betrayed no such reaction. He turned the photograph over, examined its texture, and then, with an almost casual air, placed it upon the table. "An erasure so complete," he murmured, "that even bureaucratic inefficiency has not left a trace. Fascinating." You don't seem particularly troubled by it, I observed, shifting in my chair. On the contrary, Watson, Holmes replied, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. I am profoundly troubled, not by the disappearance itself, but by the precision with which it has been executed. Consider, for a moment, the implications. To forge a false identity is difficult, yes, but to remove an identity completely, without error, that is a masterwork. Lestrade scoffed. Masterwork or not, it's driving me mad. We have witnesses swearing up and down that Henry Gifford was real. Some of them even worked for him. And yet, show them a census book, a property deed, anything official, and suddenly they start doubting their own memories. One of my own men swore he interviewed Gifford last week, but when I had him check his own notes, nothing. The pages were blank. Have you considered the possibility that this is a matter of coercion? I suggested. A well-organized group threatening or bribing those involved into silence. Lestrade ran a hand down his face. Of course I have. But how do you bribe official records? How do you threaten Scotland Yard's archives into erasing a man's name overnight? Holmes tapped a finger on the armrest. And the servant who provided you with this photograph, where is she now? Lestrade hesitated. She disappeared this morning. Holmes gave a thin smile, as expected. I felt a cold shiver creep down my spine. You anticipated this. Of course, Watson, he said, rising from his chair and moving to the window. The gaslight outside was barely visible through the heavy fog rolling in from the Thames. One does not erase a man so thoroughly without tying off loose ends. This servant was a liability. If I were the architect behind this grand vanishing act, I would ensure that any straggling threads were swiftly removed. Lestrade cleared his throat. Then you think she's dead? Holmes turned back, expression unreadable. I think she is forgotten. A heavy silence filled the room. Well, Mr. Holmes, Lestrade finally said, shifting uncomfortably, I assume you're willing to look into this. If anyone can make sense of it, it's you. Holmes smiled, but there was something in his expression that I did not like. Lestrade, he said, I believe we have already stepped into something far larger than even you suspect, and the only way to navigate such treacherous waters is to sink deeper still. He turned to me. Watson, we must begin at the last place Henry Gifford existed. I hesitated. And if that place no longer exists? Holmes' smile widened. Then, my dear fellow, we shall see whether the world itself is willing to accommodate a contradiction. Chapter 3. The air was thick with the damp embrace of London's night as our hansom cab rattled toward Kensington. Holmes sat rigid, his sharp gaze fixed upon some invisible point beyond the misted window. He had spoken little since our departure from Baker Street, lost in the labyrinth of thought that only he could navigate. I, however, was left to wrestle with my own unease. The very notion of a man erased from existence unsettled me in a way no ordinary crime ever had. A missing person, a forged document, these were things I could grasp. But the vanishing of official records, the shifting of memories, the sheer impossibility of it all, this was something altogether different. Lestrade, who had joined us, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I'll tell you, Holmes, I don't like this business one bit. The closer I look into it, the more I feel like I'm chasing smoke. Holmes remained silent, his fingers drumming against his knee. You said we would begin at the last place Henry Gifford existed. I ventured, breaking the uneasy quiet. His home in Kensington. But Lestrade said, that it is gone, Holmes finished for me. And yet, Watson, let us entertain a hypothesis. If something once existed, does its absence not leave a trace? Lestrade frowned. Meaning what, exactly? Holmes finally turned his gaze toward us. Meaning, Inspector, that the absence of a house may be more revealing than the presence of one. Lestrade exhaled in exasperation. I don't follow. "You rarely do," Holmes murmured. Before Lestrade could voice his irritation, the cab slowed. We had arrived. I stepped out first, tightening my coat against the bite of the night air. The street was lined with elegant townhouses, their wrought iron fences standing like silent sentinels against the London fog. But where number 17 Kensington Row should have been, there was nothing. Not an empty lot, not the charred remnants of a demolished home, just an unbroken stretch of pavement. Lestrade let out a low curse. I knew it. I bloody knew it. I swallowed hard. This can't be. There was a house here. A man lived here. Holmes stepped forward, his boots barely making a sound against the stone. He approached the space between number 16 and number 18, his keen eyes scanning the blank expanse before him. Then, without hesitation, he raised his walking stick and pressed it against the air. It did not pass through. Lestrade inhaled sharply. I felt my stomach turn. There was something there. Not visible, not tangible in the ordinary sense. But there. Holmes withdrew his stick and examined the tip. "Dust," he murmured. "Stone particles. Precisely what one would expect from a physical structure." He stepped closer, his hand outstretched, fingers moving as if tracing the edge of something unseen. "There is a foundation beneath our feet, gentlemen. The house is here. And yet—" "We can't see it," I finished, my voice barely above a whisper. Lestrade took an unsteady step backward. "This is unnatural." "On the contrary," Holmes said, his voice calm despite the madness of the situation. "It is deliberate." I felt a sudden wave of nausea, as though my mind rebelled against what my senses were trying to accept. Holmes, who could do such a thing? Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable. "That, Watson, is what we are going to find out." And with that, he took a step forward and vanished. Chapter 4. Holmes was there, and then he was not. One moment he stood before us, his sharp silhouette framed against the eerie glow of the street lamp. The next, he had stepped forward and vanished into the very absence where Henry Gifford's house should have been. I lurched forward instinctively. "Holmes!" Lestrade's hand shot out, gripping my shoulder. "Careful, Doctor." His voice was taut with alarm. "Did you see that? He just. He didn't finish. Neither of us could. There was no logic to what had just transpired. Holmes had not fallen, nor had he walked beyond our sight. He had simply ceased to be. I fought the tightening panic in my chest. "Holmes," I called again. The thick London fog curled against the vacant space, swallowing my voice. The street, otherwise silent, offered nothing in return. Lestrade cursed under his breath. "I don't like this. Not one bit." Neither did I. Holmes was the most rational man I had ever known. He did not believe in ghosts or illusions. If he had stepped forward, it was because he had perceived something beyond our understanding, some crack in reality that we could not yet see. And that thought terrified me more than any ordinary disappearance. Then, as if from nowhere, his voice returned. "Watson." I whirled around. "Holmes." But the voice had not come from the street before me. It came from behind. I turned sharply. Lestrade did the same. There, where nothing had been just moments ago, stood a door. A simple wooden door, blackened with age and weather, set into the brick wall between number 16 and number 18. Lestrade paled. That wasn't there before. He was right. The street had been bare when we arrived. And yet the door stood before us now as if it had been there all along, waiting for someone to notice. My pulse quickened. Holmes' voice had come from the other side. "Holmes." I pressed my palm against the door, finding the wood strangely cold. "Are you inside?" "Yes, Watson." His voice was steady, but there was something in it I did not like. "You must come in." Lestrade shook his head violently. Like hell we will. What in God's name is happening here? Lestrade, Holmes' voice returned, this time with an edge of urgency. You must come inside. Now, I exchanged a glance with Lestrade. I could see the hesitation in his face, the raw, unspoken fear. But I also saw something else, something I recognized in myself. We could not leave Holmes alone in whatever place he had stepped into. I swallowed hard. Are you with me, Lestrade? He hesitated for only a moment, then exhaled sharply. Bloody hell. Let's go. With that, I grasped the iron handle and pulled. The door swung open without resistance. A rush of cold air spilled out, carrying the scent of old dust and something else, something I could not quite name. Beyond the threshold, there was no house, no grand Kensington home. Only darkness, and somewhere within it, Holmes was waiting. Taking a steadying breath, I stepped inside. Lestrade followed. The door closed behind us. Chapter 5. The moment we stepped through the threshold, the air changed. The damp chill of the London streets was gone, replaced by a heavy stillness, thick and oppressive. The door closed behind us without a sound, and when I turned to look, there was no handle, no sign it had ever existed. Lestrade swore under his breath. This isn't right. He was correct. We had entered not a house, but something else entirely. The space before us stretched into an impossible blackness. There were no gas lamps, no windows, and yet I could see faint outlines of walls, furniture, even a grand staircase that should have been lost to the dark. The light, if it could be called that, did not come from any source I could perceive. It simply was. Holmes, I called. My voice felt smaller than it should have, swallowed by the weight of the silence. Then a figure emerged from the shadows. Holmes. But something was wrong. He stood at the base of the staircase, his form barely outlined in the dim glow. His posture was stiff, his hands clasped behind his back. He was staring at something I could not see. Holmes, I called again, moving toward him. He did not turn. Lestrade hesitated behind me. What in God's name is he doing? I reached Holmes' side and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. His body was rigid beneath my touch. Holmes, look at me. Slowly, very slowly, he turned his head. His eyes, those sharp, all-seeing eyes, were clouded, unfocused. He blinked once, twice, then his gaze cleared. Ah, he said quietly. Watson, Lestrade, you made it. Of course we did. I snapped, unable to suppress the growing unease in my chest. What happened? Where are we? Holmes inhaled deeply, as though surfacing from deep water. We are inside Henry Gifford's house. I stared at him. No, Holmes, we can't be. The house doesn't exist. Holmes finally turned fully toward me, and though his face was calm, his expression was taut with something I had only seen once before, uncertainty. It exists, Watson, he said softly, but only for those who remember it. Lestrade made a noise of frustration. Enough of this nonsense. If we're inside Gifford's house, where the hell is he? Holmes did not answer immediately. He looked around, scanning the space, as if mapping out something unseen. He is here, Holmes murmured at last. Or rather, he was. I followed his gaze. At first, I saw nothing but the skeletal remains of what must have once been an opulent home. Dust lay thick on every surface, yet there was no sign of decay, no smell of neglect, no evidence that time had touched this place at all. Then I saw them. 7 candles, placed at precise intervals along the staircase. Each one burned with a weak, flickering light, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. 7 candles, Lestrade muttered. What does it mean? Holmes moved toward them, his hand hovering just above the nearest flame. A marker, he said, or perhaps a seal. I felt my skin crawl. A seal for what? Holmes did not respond immediately. Instead, he bent closer, inspecting the melted wax pooled at the base of each candle. They have been burning for some time, he noted, yet the wax is undisturbed. No drips, no sign of age, as if they have been frozen in time. Lestrade shifted uneasily. Holmes, what are we dealing with here? Holmes straightened, his eyes sharp once more. A question I intend to answer. But first, we must proceed with caution. Something is keeping this house in place, something unnatural. He turned to me. Watson, you said this house should not exist. I would ask you to reconsider. What we perceive is dictated by what we accept as truth. If reality itself can be rewritten, then what happens to those who refuse to acknowledge the revision? My mouth was dry. Are you saying Henry Gifford is here, but we cannot see him? Holmes' gaze darkened. Or worse, he is here and he cannot see us. A chill ran through me. Lestrade, growing impatient, stepped forward. Enough riddles, Holmes. If Gifford's here, we need to find him, or his body. Holmes nodded. Yes, but I suspect the answer lies not in a corpse, but in the candles themselves. With that, he reached out and snuffed out the nearest flame. The house trembled. A gust of wind, sharp and ice-cold, roared through the space. The remaining candles flickered violently. Somewhere, deep in the shadows, something shifted. Then, for the first time since we arrived, I heard it. A voice. Weak, hollow. Who's there? Lestrade turned pale. That came from upstairs. Holmes exhaled. Then let us pay Mr. Gifford a visit, shall we? He stepped toward the staircase. The second candle flickered. Anne died. Chapter 6. The second candle went out, and the entire house seemed to exhale. The walls groaned like an ancient thing disturbed from its slumber. The air thickened, pressing against my skin, and though the house remained as silent as before, I felt the weight of something unseen watching us from the darkness above. Holmes, unfazed, took the first step up the staircase. Lestrade hesitated. I have a bad feeling about this, Holmes. I couldn't blame him. Every instinct in me screamed that we should not be here, that we had trespassed into something beyond our comprehension. And yet Holmes moved forward with his usual unwavering confidence. He paused only once, running his fingers along the wooden railing. Curious, he murmured. I swallowed. What is? This dust. He lifted his fingers, showing me the fine layer of grey that clung to his skin. It should have settled long ago, and yet it moves as if disturbed only moments ago. Lestrade snorted. That's hardly surprising, considering. He stopped. Holmes and I turned toward him. Lestrade's face had gone rigid, his eyes locked onto the railing. That's impossible, he whispered. I followed his gaze. There, where Holmes' fingers had just disturbed the dust, there was no mark, no trail where his touch should have been. The dust had resettled, as if time had undone itself. A chill crawled up my spine. Holmes, however, simply hummed. Interesting. With that, he resumed his ascent. Lestrade and I exchanged an uneasy glance before following. The upper landing was suffocatingly narrow, the ceiling pressing down like the inside of a coffin. The floorboards beneath our feet did not creak as they should have. Instead, they gave the unsettling sensation of yielding slightly, as if stepping on something not entirely solid. Holmes led us past 2 empty rooms before stopping outside a closed door at the far end of the hall. I knew, without being told, that this was where the voice had come from. Lestrade exhaled. If Gifford's in there, I swear I'll. Holmes raised a hand for silence. We stood in absolute stillness. Then, a sound. Soft, fragile, A faint shuffle of movement from the other side of the door. Holmes reached for the handle. Before he could grasp it, the door creaked open. Not fully, just an inch. An invitation. Holmes pushed it the rest of the way. The room beyond was utterly black. No gas lamps, no windows. Nothing but an overwhelming emptiness, swallowing the faint glow from the hall behind us. But then, as our eyes adjusted, I saw it. The chair, and a man sitting in it. Motionless. At first I thought him dead, but then I saw the faint rise and fall of his chest, the slow, shallow rhythm of someone who had been waiting for a very long time. Holmes stepped forward. "Mr. Gifford, I presume." The man did not respond. Holmes took another step. I followed, Lestrade close behind. As we crossed the threshold, something shifted. A strange sensation, like stepping through an invisible veil. The air turned heavier, colder. Then, the door behind us closed. Lestrade whirled around, reaching for the handle. "No, no, no, no. It won't open," Holmes said simply. Lestrade cursed, tugging uselessly at the door. I turned my attention to the man in the chair. His head was bowed, his hands resting limply in his lap. He wore a dark suit, the fabric faded and worn, as if untouched by time, but never quite part of it. Holmes moved closer. Henry Gifford. Still, no response. I stepped forward, my voice softer. "Sir, can you hear us?" Finally, his fingers twitched. Then he lifted his head. I had seen the dead before, many times in war and in crime, but never had I seen something so close to death while still breathing. His skin was pallid, stretched too tightly over sharp cheekbones. His eyes, God help me, his eyes were wrong. There was depth to them, but no recognition, no presence. Like a man who had been looking at something for so long that he had forgotten how to see. Holmes crouched in front of him. "Mr. Gifford, do you know where you are?" A beat of silence. Then the faintest movement, his lips parting just slightly. "I waited," he whispered. A shudder ran through me. Holmes remained calm. "For what?" Gifford blinked, as if the question had not occurred to him. His lips formed words too quiet to hear. Holmes leaned in. "Speak, man." A ragged breath. Then, "For someone to remember me." The candle on the desk beside him flickered and died. The house trembled again, and the shadows moved. Chapter 7. The candle died, and with it something in the house shifted, something we could not see but felt in our very bones. A breath of cold air swept through the room, carrying the scent of damp stone and old paper. Henry Gifford sat motionless in his chair, his sunken eyes locked onto Holmes with an intensity that made my skin crawl. His voice, when he spoke again, was as fragile as old parchment. "You should not be here." Holmes remained composed. "And yet, Mr. Gifford, here we are. Tell me, what precisely have we intruded upon?" Gifford's lips moved soundlessly before he let out a slow exhale. "You see me," he murmured. "That is unexpected." Lestrade, still rattled, finally found his voice. "You disappeared, Gifford. No records, no history, no house. But here you sit like a ghost in his own tomb." At the word ghost, Gifford flinched. Holmes observed him carefully. "We are not the first to find you, are we?" Gifford's head tilted slightly. "No, but you are the first to remember." I felt a prickle of unease. "What does that mean?" Gifford blinked slowly, as if he were struggling to recall the answer himself. "They come," he murmured. "They always come. They ask their questions, and then they forget." Holmes' expression sharpened. "Who are they, Mr. Gifford?" Gifford let out something between a laugh and a sigh. "Men of law, scholars, curious minds." His gaze flickered to Lestrade. "Detectives, Lestrade tensed. "You're saying I've been here before?" Gifford nodded, and something inside me turned to ice. "That's impossible," I said. Lestrade would have remembered. Gifford interrupted, his thin lips twisting into something resembling amusement. "No, he wouldn't. That's not how it works." Holmes leaned in, his voice a quiet blade. "And how does it work, Mr. Gifford?" Gifford's gaze turned distant. "They erase," he whispered. "They take names, places, time. They unmake the knowing of things." He exhaled, voice shaking now. "Do you understand, Mr. Holmes? A man is only real so long as he is remembered. I have not been real for a very, very long time." Lestrade swore under his breath. "This is madness." Holmes ignored him. "Who are they?" Gifford's body trembled slightly. His fingers clenched the arms of his chair, as though something unseen were pressing upon him. "They watch." His eyes darted to the dark corners of the room. "Even now." Instinctively, I followed his gaze, but there was nothing there, just the unnatural shadows, deep and shifting in a way that made my stomach turn. Holmes considered him for a moment, then reached into his coat and withdrew the photograph. Gifford's photograph, the one Lestrade had obtained from the vanished servant. "Do you recognize this?" Holmes asked, placing it on the desk beside him. Gifford's breath hitched. His trembling fingers reached for it, hovering just above the aged tintype as though he feared to touch it. "This," his eyes lifted, wide with something akin to awe. "This is proof." The candle beside him flickered. Gifford grabbed the photograph, his bony fingers clutching it as though it were his last tether to existence. "They tried to take this," he whispered. "But someone held on." Holmes nodded. "Indeed. But why would they erase you, Mr. Gifford? What did you do?" A silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Then softly, "I remembered something I was not meant to." The candlelight wavered violently. Lestrade took an uneasy step backward. "Holmes, I don't like this. We need to get out of here." Holmes ignored him. "What did you remember?" Gifford swallowed. "A name." Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Whose name?" Gifford's lips parted. The shadows around us thickened. The air pressed against my chest, and for the first time since stepping into this cursed place, I felt true fear. Gifford opened his mouth. And then something moved behind him. I barely had time to react before the last candle went out. Total darkness swallowed us, and somewhere in the blackness a voice that was not Henry Gifford's whispered, "No more remembering." The room collapsed. Chapter 8. Darkness swallowed us whole. Not the mere absence of light, but something deeper, something absolute. I could not see, could not move, could not even be certain I was still standing. It was as if the very concept of existence had unraveled, and we had fallen into the void left behind. Then a whisper. Not a sound, not truly, but a pressure against my mind. A voice I did not hear so much as feel. No more remembering. A cold terror unlike any I had known before slathered through me. Holmes. My voice was muffled, swallowed by the abyss. Lestrade. No answer. Then a spark. Not of fire or light, but of something more real than the emptiness around me. A force of will, sharp as a blade. Holmes' voice cut through the void. "Watson, focus." I gasped as sensation returned. The floor was beneath my feet again. The walls of the room reasserted themselves. Shapes emerged from the darkness. Lestrade, hands braced against the desk. Henry Gifford, still frozen in his chair. Holmes, standing tall, unshaken. And behind him, a shape in the darkness. It had no form, no face, nothing I could describe in human terms. It was not seen so much as felt, an absence that had taken the shape of a thing that should not be. It whispered again. Forget. A wave of nausea slammed into me. My head throbbed. Something was pulling at my mind, scraping at the edges of my thoughts, peeling away at what I knew, at who I was. Holmes took a step forward. You made a mistake. The thing in the dark did not speak, but the air shifted. Holmes' voice was sharp, controlled. You erased Henry Gifford, his records, his home, his very memory. But you overlooked something. The shape twitched. You forgot himself, Holmes continued. Gifford remembers his own name, his own existence. And that, my dear unseen adversary, is the single flaw in your perfect design. The air trembled. The darkness seethed. Gifford, still clutching the photograph, looked up, his sunken eyes widening. I am real. The moment he said it, I felt something shift. The weight on my mind lessened. The suffocating pull of forgetting began to unravel. Holmes smiled. Ah, I see. You do not erase reality. You erase perception. But you cannot erase something while it is being actively remembered. A low, distorted sound echoed through the room. A noise that might have been a growl or a warning. Holmes turned to Gifford. Speak your name. Now. Gifford hesitated. Lestrade swore. For God's sake, man, say it. Gifford gasped, as if breaking through deep water. Henry Gifford. The darkness reeled. The shape twisted, flickered, as if struggling against something unseen. Holmes pressed forward. You erased him from the world, but now the world is remembering him again. That means your hold is breaking. The void trembled violently. The house shuddered. Holmes turned to me, eyes burning with certainty. Watson, the candles. I barely understood, but I acted. I lunged toward the desk, hands fumbling in the dark. The matches. Where were the bloody matches? My fingers found them, struck one. The tiny flame sputtered to life. And with it, so did the world. The moment the candle rekindled, the shadows lurched back. The weight in my skull lifted. The thing in the darkness screamed, a sound that did not pass through my ears, but carved into my very being. One by one, I struck the matches, relighting the candles. With every flame restored, the house solidified. The unnatural weight receded. Reality, as we understood it, reasserted itself. The final candle caught, its small fire flickering stubbornly against the unnatural dark. And just like that, the thing was gone. The house settled. The pressure, the suffocating pull of forgetting, vanished. Silence. Then Lestrade let out a shuddering breath. Tell me that bloody thing is gone. Holmes exhaled slowly. Not gone, Inspector, but unable to hold its grasp. He turned to Gifford. It will not return for you, not so long as we remember that you are real. Gifford's thin shoulders trembled. He clutched the photograph as if it alone tethered him to existence. I am real, he whispered again. Holmes gave him a firm nod. Yes, Mr. Gifford. And that is what saved you. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The nightmare was over. Or so I thought, because as I turned to the door, ready to leave this place forever, I saw it, just for a moment, a faint impression in the shadows, a shape, watching, waiting, and then it was gone. Chapter 9. We left the house without speaking, or rather, we left the space where the house had been, because as soon as our feet crossed the threshold, the old wooden door we had entered through was no longer there. Instead, we stood on the empty pavement of Kensington Row. No house, no sign it had ever existed. Lestrade swore under his breath and rubbed his temple. Bloody hell, Holmes, tell me you saw that. Tell me we weren't just wandering through an illusion. Holmes dusted off his coat, seemingly unfazed. No illusion, Inspector. The house was quite real, so long as it was remembered. Lestrade let out a dry laugh, devoid of humour. And now it's gone, just like before. Not quite, I murmured, glancing at the man beside us. Henry Gifford. His frail form stood rigid, his thin fingers still wrapped around the old photograph, as though it were the only thing keeping him anchored to the world. His breath came in short, uncertain gasps, as if he were testing whether he still existed beyond the walls of that forgotten house. Holmes watched him closely. "How do you feel, Mr. Gifford?" Gifford swallowed hard. I remember." His voice shook, but there was a quiet certainty beneath it. "I remember everything." "Good," Holmes said. "That means they failed." I stiffened at that. They, he had said. Not it. Not the thing that had lurked in the dark. Something more. Something plural. Lestrade exhaled sharply. "Holmes, I need answers. I've handled some damn strange cases, but this is something else. What the devil was that thing?" Holmes' expression darkened. "Not a thing at all, Inspector. An entity, or rather an intelligence of sorts. One that does not kill, nor steal, nor break the laws of nature as we understand them." He turned his gaze to the now empty space where the house had once been. "It simply erases." Lestrade paled. "Erases what?" "Truth," Holmes said simply. "History. People. Time itself." The words sent an unnatural chill through me. Gifford's fingers tightened around the photograph. "And yet I remain." Holmes nodded approvingly. "Indeed, that is the first victory against them." Lestrade frowned. "Then what now? If we expose these things, surely they'll come for him again." He gestured to Gifford. "Or for us." Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he reached into his coat and withdrew his notebook. I watched as he turned to a blank page and with deliberate care wrote, "Henry Gifford, ERASED, Vitreed." He tore the page out and handed it to Gifford. "Keep this with you at all times," Holmes instructed. "Every day read it, speak your name. Write it again if you must. So long as you continue to remember, they cannot take you again." Gifford clutched the paper as though it were his very soul. Lestrade shook his head. "You're saying memory itself is a shield against this, against them." "Memory is the last defense of reality, Inspector," Holmes murmured. I shivered. Holmes turned back to Gifford. "You said you remembered everything. That means you remember the name, don't you?" Gifford hesitated. His breathing quickened. Lestrade frowned. "What name?" Holmes did not break his gaze from Gifford. "The name you spoke before the final candle went out. The name that brought them upon you." The old man looked stricken. His lips trembled. His voice faltered. He looked to me, then Lestrade, then back to Holmes. Holmes nodded once reassuringly. "You are not alone this time, Mr. Gifford. Speak it." Gifford swallowed hard. And then, in the barest whisper, he said it. A name I did not recognize, a name that did not exist. And yet, the very moment it was spoken, something around us shifted. Lestrade staggered, suddenly dizzy. What just?" Gifford gasped, clutching his chest. His breath turned shallow. His fingers trembled violently. And Holmes stood rigid, his sharp gaze flicking across the empty space of Kensington Row. And then softly he murmured, "They heard." A gust of wind swept down the street. Every lamp along the road went out. Chapter 10. The street lamps died. Not flickered, not dimmed. They simply ceased to be, snuffed out in an instant, leaving us swallowed in a blackness deeper than night. A cold wind curled through Kensington Row, though there was no movement in the air. It was the absence of something, the presence of nothing. Gifford's breathing turned ragged. His hand clutched his chest as if he could feel something reaching for him, something neither Holmes nor I could see. Lestrade cursed, fumbling for a match. "Blast it! Holmes, what's happening?" Holmes did not answer at once. His silhouette stood motionless against the void, his keen eyes locked on the space ahead, where the house had once been, where now only absence remained. I saw his fingers tighten around the paper in his hand, the one where he had written Henry Gifford's name. "We were heard," he murmured. Lestrade struck the match, its weak flame sputtering to life. The moment it did, I saw something shift in the darkness. The street was not empty. Something moved at its edges, not figures, not men. Impressions, shapes that did not belong to the natural world, not walking, unfolding, as if they had been there all along, but were only now stepping forward. Lestrade saw them too. His breath hitched. "What the hell?" "Hold your ground," Holmes ordered. Lestrade's fingers twitched toward his revolver. "Tell me I'm not going mad." Holmes remained calm. "Not mad, Inspector. Merely seeing what was not meant to be seen." The figures did not advance. They remained at the periphery, shifting, waiting. For what, I did not know. And then Gifford gasped. His legs buckled. I caught him before he collapsed to the pavement, his frail body shaking violently. "The name," he choked. They took it." Holmes crouched beside him. "Steady yourself, Mr. Gifford. Tell me what you mean." Gifford's eyes darted wildly. He clutched at his own temples, his expression twisted in agony. "I said it. But I don't remember what I said." A cold chill passed through me. Lestrade exhaled sharply. "You're telling me." He turned to Holmes. "They erased it, just like that." Holmes' face was unreadable. "They have done it before, and they will do it again." Gifford let out a weak, trembling sob. I remembered it. I knew it. But the moment I spoke, his fingers clawed at his own forehead, as if trying to pry open his own mind. "It's gone." I felt my own stomach churn. This was worse than murder, worse than death. To know something had existed, to know you had spoken it, only to have it ripped from reality itself. Lestrade turned to Holmes. "So that's it? We lost, they win." Holmes stood slowly, dusting off his coat. "No, Inspector, not yet." Lestrade gave a hollow laugh. "And how the bloody hell do you fight something that unmakes reality itself?" Holmes turned, his sharp gaze cutting through the gloom. "We do the one thing they cannot stop," he said. "And what's that?" Lestrade snapped. Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew his notebook once more. "We write it down." Lestrade's mouth opened, then shut. "That's your plan." Holmes smiled faintly. "A name is only forgotten if there is no record of it. And so, gentlemen, we shall make one." He tore a fresh page from his notebook and offered me his pencil. "Watson, if you would be so kind." My hand trembled as I took it. I hesitated because I knew that if I tried to write the name, the one Gifford had spoken only moments ago, I would find nothing. A blank space in my mind. I swallowed, forced my fingers to move, and wrote. But what appeared on the paper was not a name. It was only a single empty line. I felt the weight of Holmes' eyes on me. "Watson." I exhaled shakily, shaking my head. I don't know what to write." Gifford's breathing turned ragged. "It's happening again," he whispered. Lestrade's face twisted in frustration. "So that's it. It's gone, just like before." Holmes considered this for a long moment. "Then," he said, "not quite." He took the page from my hands and held it up to the dim light of the single remaining match. "Look at it," he instructed. "What do you see?" Lestrade frowned. Nothing. Just a blank space. Holmes nodded. Precisely. I swallowed. I don't follow. Holmes' gaze met mine. If it were truly erased, Watson, there would not even be a blank space. There would be nothing at all. I stared at him, then back at the paper. An empty line. But a line nonetheless. Holmes smiled faintly. They may have stolen the name, but they have not stolen the absence of it. He folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket. And that, gentlemen, is how we shall follow the trail. I shivered. Holmes, what are you saying? He turned away, facing the darkness where the figures still loomed at the edges of the street. I am saying, he murmured, that we have been given a most interesting challenge. The wind stirred, and in the void something whispered, waiting, watching. Holmes exhaled, then turned to us. Come, Watson. Come, Lestrade. I do believe we have a conspiracy to unravel. And with that he stepped forward, toward the shadows, toward the unknown, toward the truth. Chapter 11. The moment Holmes stepped forward, the shadows moved. Not as a mass, not like men, but like something fluid, something slipping between the cracks of reality itself. I felt them coil along the edges of my vision, pressing inward without ever fully revealing themselves. Lestrade stiffened. Holmes. Keep walking, Inspector, Holmes murmured. Do not stop. Do not look back. Lestrade cursed but obeyed. I followed suit, though every fibre of my being screamed at me to turn, to confirm whether the shifting impressions behind us were real or some waking hallucination. Holmes led us away from Kensington Row, his pace measured but deliberate. The gas lamps remained dead, the street unnaturally silent. Not even the distant echo of carriage wheels broke the oppressive stillness. I struggled to keep my breathing steady. Holmes, where are we going? Somewhere they cannot follow, he said simply. Lestrade scoffed, but I caught the tremor in his voice. And where might that be exactly? Holmes did not answer at once. He reached into his coat, fingers brushing against the folded slip of paper, the one that contained only a blank line where a name should have been. Then finally he said, Scotland Yard. Lestrade's steps faltered. What? Holmes continued without pause. We have encountered something that removes all trace of a person's existence. The only way to counteract such an entity is to expose it, record its absence in a place impervious to tampering. Scotland Yard's archives are extensive. If we can establish that something should exist but does not, we may find a gap large enough to follow. Lestrade exhaled sharply. You mean to make it official? Holmes nodded. Precisely. Erasure is most effective when the world does not question it. But what happens when a missing name is filed, written, and acknowledged by the law? A pause. Then Lestrade muttered, Bloody hell. I glanced back, just once, and immediately wished I hadn't. For though I saw nothing directly, I felt it, an unnatural pressure, shifting at the very edges of the street, waiting. They were watching, waiting for us to forget. I turned forward, heart hammering. Holmes had picked up the pace, guiding us through the quiet streets. Though the lamps remained dark, the familiar roads of London slowly returned around us, taverns, alleys, shops, none of them quite as I remembered them, but real nonetheless. Lestrade muttered under his breath, What happens when we get there? Holmes' expression was unreadable. Then, my dear Lestrade, we will see whether reality is as malleable as they believe it to be. I felt the weight of the moment settle over us. We were about to take a forgotten name and carve it back into history. We were about to fight something that had never lost, and I did not know if we could win. We turned the final corner, and there it was, Scotland Yard, safe, bright, unchanged. For now. Holmes exhaled, his first visible sign of relief. Come, gentlemen, We have little time, and as we stepped toward the yard, the shadows behind us vanished. But I knew. They were not gone. They were merely waiting. Chapter 12. Scotland Yard loomed before us, an island of solidity in a world that now felt uncertain. Its gas lamps burned steadily, its iron gates stood firm, and yet I could not shake the feeling that the moment we entered, something fundamental would change. Holmes did not hesitate. With Henry Gifford shuffling between us, we ascended the steps, and Lestrade pushed the door open. The warm glow of lanterns filled the entrance hall, and the familiar clatter of constables moving about their work was like a balm against the unnatural silence we had left behind. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe we were safe. Then Holmes spoke. "Lestrade, take us to the archives." "Immediately." Lestrade hesitated. "Look, Holmes, even if I wanted to, I can't just march you in there and start rewriting official records." Holmes turned, his gaze sharp as steel. "You must. We do not need to rewrite anything. We need only to create an absence so large that it forces the world to acknowledge it." Lestrade ran a hand through his hair, clearly at war with himself. Then he let out a frustrated sigh. "Fine. But if I lose my post over this, Holmes, I swear." Holmes was already moving. We followed him down the hallways, past rows of desks where uniformed men scribbled reports or held low conversations over case files. None paid us any mind. We descended 2 flights of stairs until we reached a heavy iron door, Scotland Yard's central archives. Lestrade pulled out a key from his coat and unlocked it with a resigned grunt. "If anyone asks, I'll just say you bullied me into it." Holmes smiled. "As ever, Inspector, your devotion to the law is commendable." Lestrade muttered something under his breath, but held the door open for us. We stepped inside. The room smelled of old paper and ink, of dust that had settled over decades of London's history. Shelves lined the walls, stretching high into the gloom, filled with reports, birth registries, property deeds, every name that had ever mattered, every crime that had ever been noted, and somewhere among them, the void where Henry Gifford should have been. Holmes did not hesitate. He strode directly to the nearest index, flipping through pages with calculated precision. His hands were steady, but his eyes burned with intensity. Lestrade, watching him, let out a long breath. "You really think this is going to work?" Holmes did not look up. Erasure is most effective when it is unnoticed. We are about to notice it, Inspector, and that is something they cannot counter. Lestrade muttered something I did not quite catch. Holmes found the section he sought. The page he opened to was crisp, undisturbed, too undisturbed. There was no record of a Henry Gifford, no property owned in Kensington Row, no investigations into smuggling antiquities. Nothing. As if he had never existed at all. Holmes nodded as if he had expected this. Then he withdrew his notebook and tore out the page on which he had written earlier, the one where I had tried to write the name, and failed. He placed it carefully on top of the open index. The blank space stared back at us, mocking us. Lestrade exhaled sharply. What now? Holmes reached for a pen and ink, and then, in precise, deliberate strokes, he wrote, "Henry Gifford, missing record." The ink dried. The words remained. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Holmes tapped the paper. "Now it exists again." Lestrade frowned. "That's it? We just write it down." Holmes' smile was cold. "We make it real again. The more it is recorded, spoken, acknowledged, the harder it becomes for them to erase." He turned to me. "Watson, take down the details. Date, time, location, every missing fact. Write it in your journal." And Lestrade. Holmes turned to the inspector. "You must file an official missing persons report. Lestrade balked. On what grounds? Holmes' expression darkened. Because Inspector Henry Gifford is missing. Not from his home, not from his life, but from the very fabric of reality. Lestrade inhaled deeply, rubbing his temple. I must be out of my damn mind, he muttered. But he reached for a fresh file, and he wrote the name. For a moment, nothing happened. The air in the archive remained still. The pages remained written. And then the lamps flickered. Once, twice. Then they held steady. Holmes exhaled, leaning back. They felt that. Lestrade sat back, pale but steady. And what happens now? Holmes pocketed the original page, the one with the blank line. Now, Inspector, we wait. I frowned. For what? Holmes turned to me, his voice quiet. To see if we have truly beaten them. The thought chilled me, because I knew. This was not over. Not yet. And somewhere, beyond the reach of our words and paper, in the places where memory itself could be rewritten, they were watching. Chapter 13. We left the archives in silence. Lestrade locked the heavy iron door behind us, his fingers lingering on the key longer than necessary, as though he feared turning away from it. I understood the sentiment. The moment we had committed Henry Gifford's name back into written history, something in the very air had changed, something we could not yet define. Holmes led us back up the dim stairwell, his movements as methodical as ever, but I could sense the tension in his frame. Even he did not know what would come next. Lestrade spoke first, his voice hushed. So what now? We just wait to see if they try to erase him again. Holmes didn't answer immediately. He reached into his coat, fingers brushing over his notebook, the one that now contained irrefutable proof that Henry Gifford had existed. That, for the first time, they had failed to fully remove him. No, he said at last. We force their hand. Lestrade scoffed. And how do you propose we do that? Holmes stepped into the main corridor of Scotland Yard, where a handful of constables still worked through the night. By seeing if the world remembers Henry Gifford as it should. I frowned. Meaning? Holmes turned to Lestrade. Have one of your men retrieve any public record from before last week? A newspaper, a ledger, anything. Lestrade sighed. And if his name isn't there? Then we will have our answer. Lestrade instructed a junior officer to fetch the Times from the previous fortnight. We waited in strained silence. Holmes, as ever, was unreadable, though I knew his mind was racing ahead of us all. I found myself glancing at Gifford. He had barely spoken since we'd arrived, and I did not blame him. His very existence had been in question. His reality hinged on whether we had succeeded in anchoring him back into the world. His fingers twitched against his coat, still clutching the torn scrap of paper Holmes had given him, the one that bore only his name, as if it was the last thing tethering him to the world. The constable returned, carrying an old folded newspaper. Lestrade took it from him, flipping through its pages. His eyes darted over the print, searching. Then he stopped. Holmes noticed immediately. Well, Lestrade hesitated. He should be here. Holmes extended his hand. Show me. Lestrade handed over the paper. Holmes scanned it quickly, then slowed, studying a particular section. I leaned in. What is it? Holmes' voice was quiet. The article is intact. A report on smuggling routes out of the Thames. It was meant to mention Henry Gifford's name as a suspected orchestrator. I swallowed, and Holmes turned the paper toward us. The name was gone. Not blacked out, not omitted. It was simply missing. The sentence read, authorities continue their investigation into illegal shipments moving through the docks, with suspicions pointing toward. And then, nothing. As if the sentence had been left unfinished. I felt the blood drain from my face. This was altered. Holmes' lips pressed into a thin line. Not altered, Watson. Removed. Lestrade exhaled sharply. Then we didn't fix anything. Holmes did not look up. Not necessarily. Lestrade's voice rose. His bloody name still isn't there, Holmes. Correct, Holmes said, finally lifting his gaze. But the gap remains. I frowned. Meaning. Holmes' fingers drummed against the paper. Before we intervened, reality had compensated for Gifford's absence. His name had been erased so completely that even the structure of past documents adapted to ensure there was no evidence a name was missing at all. He tapped the blank space in the sentence. And yet now, the structure remains, but his name is missing. A void left behind. Lestrade muttered a curse. So what? We forced them to make a mistake. Holmes smiled faintly. Precisely, Inspector. I inhaled sharply. Then this means they are losing control. A heavy silence settled over us. Gifford, who had said nothing until now, let out a shaking breath. Then I exist. It wasn't a question. Holmes nodded. Yes, Mr. Gifford, you exist. I should have felt relief. But I didn't. Something gnawed at the edges of my mind, a pressure I could not shake. Then the lamps flickered. It was brief, but I saw it. The way the flame trembled, the dimming of light for the barest moment before steadying. And for a fraction of a second, I felt something watching. Holmes noticed it too. His posture stiffened. Lestrade ran a hand down his face. What now? Holmes spoke without turning. Now we are observed. I shuddered. You mean? They are aware we have forced an error in their design, Holmes murmured. Which means they will react accordingly. Lestrade let out a harsh laugh. Wonderful. And what exactly does that mean for us? Holmes finally turned. His eyes were unreadable, but his voice was steady. It means we must now determine the cost of remembering. And somewhere in the shadowed corners of Scotland Yard, something shifted. Something waiting. Watching. And then, just barely, a whisper. One I knew only Holmes and I could hear. Forget. Chapter 14. For a long moment, no one moved. The whisper had been so faint, so insidious, that I might have convinced myself I had imagined it. But I saw the way Holmes' fingers twitched, the way his sharp eyes flicked toward the darkened corners of the room. He had heard it too. Lestrade, oblivious to the spectral presence we now felt, exhaled and rubbed his face. All right, Holmes, you've proven they can slip up. We forced them to leave a blank space where Gifford's name once was. But what does that actually mean? If they can still erase what they want, aren't we just buying time? Holmes was silent for a moment. Then he did something that sent a cold shiver down my spine. He took his notebook from his coat, flipped to a blank page, and wrote a single word. Forget. Lestrade frowned. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Holmes turned the notebook toward us. They whisper it, do they not? I swallowed. Yes. Then let us see if the written word is as fragile as memory itself. And with that, he snapped the notebook shut. The gas lamps flickered again. This time, they stayed dim. The temperature in the archive shifted, the air thick with a static charge. I could feel something pressing in, not a presence, but an absence, something we could not see, but which we felt in the spaces between our thoughts. Gifford whimpered, his breath quickening. They're here. Lestrade stiffened, his hand instinctively reaching toward his revolver, though we all knew it would do no good. Holmes, however, remained unmoved. His voice was crisp, unshaken. Yes, Mr. Gifford. And they are listening. A creak sounded from behind us. I turned, heart hammering. At first, there was nothing, just the long stretch of shelves, the endless rows of documents lining the archive's walls. But then, a book shifted, just slightly. Then another, a slow, deliberate movement, as if unseen fingers were tracing their spines, searching. Holmes watched carefully. Fascinating. Lestrade swore under his breath. This isn't fascinating, Holmes. This is damned unnatural. Holmes didn't respond. Instead, he lifted his notebook again, opened it, and the word was gone. Not erased, not scratched out, simply absent, as if he had never written it at all. I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. Holmes let out a quiet breath. Now we understand the rules. Lestrade turned sharply. Rules? What bloody rules? Holmes' eyes gleamed. They erase what is not resisted. Lestrade blinked. What? Holmes held up the notebook. Had I read the word aloud before closing the book, had we all acknowledged it fully in our minds, it might have stayed. But I wrote it, and we moved on, allowing the act itself to fade. He turned the blank page toward us. That is when they strike. The realization sent ice through my veins. They wait for the moment when something is forgotten by the mind itself, not erased instantly, but left to decay naturally. Holmes nodded. Indeed, Watson. Which means, he turned to Gifford. You are not safe. Gifford flinched. But you said. I said you exist, Holmes interrupted. And so long as you fight to exist, they cannot take you again. But tell me, Mr. Gifford, since we left Kensington Row, how often have you spoken your own name? Gifford paled. Holmes pressed on, his voice cutting through the thick air like a scalpel. You have clung to that piece of paper I gave you, but have you read it aloud? Have you reinforced your own reality, or have you relied on us to do so for you? Gifford trembled. His lips parted, and he hesitated. Holmes' expression darkened. That is how they reclaim you. Lestrade muttered a curse. Holmes, you mean to say? I mean to say, Inspector, Holmes said quietly, that they do not merely erase. They wait. A sudden, sharp gust of wind tore through the archive, despite there being no open windows, no explanation for it. The lamps flickered violently, and Gifford screamed. I spun toward him just in time to see his body twitch, his limbs seizing. His hands flew to his throat, as if something unseen was pulling at him, dragging him into the abyss. Hold him. Holmes barked. Lestrade and I lunged forward, grabbing Gifford by the arms as he convulsed. His mouth opened, but no sound came. Then, a voice that was not his whispered from his lips. Forget. The lamps died. The entire archive was plunged into darkness. A pressure, immense and suffocating, filled the room. I felt something pressing against my skull, clawing at the edges of my mind, trying to pry something loose. Something important. Something vital. Something I could not afford to lose. Holmes' voice rang out, firm, unwavering. Gifford, speak your name. Silence. Then, a gasp. Gifford's eyes snapped open, wild with terror. He wrenched against our grip, chest heaving. I. Holmes tightened his hold. Say it. Gifford choked, then forced the words from his trembling lips. Henry Gifford. The pressure vanished. The lamps flared back to life. The silence that followed was deafening. Gifford sat between us, barely conscious. Holmes released him, allowing him to sink to the floor, his body shuddering with exertion. I turned, expecting the archive to be unchanged. I was wrong. Because behind us, every single file in the room had been pulled from the shelves and lay scattered across the floor. Every single one. Lestrade took a slow step back. Holmes, what the hell is this? Holmes exhaled, surveying the chaos. A warning, Inspector. Lestrade swallowed. Then what do we do? Holmes knelt beside Gifford, steadying him. "We do not let them win." His voice was quiet, but unshaken. "We continue remembering." A pause. Then, just barely, from somewhere deep in the darkness beyond the door, a whisper. "Then we will take you instead." The room turned deathly cold. And for the first time that night, Sherlock Holmes hesitated. Chapter 15. The words echoed through the archive, though they had no source. "Then we will take you instead." Holmes stood utterly still. Lestrade let out a breath between clenched teeth. "Tell me I imagined that." "You did not," Holmes said quietly. The air had turned thick, weighted, as if we stood at the bottom of a deep ocean, pressure bearing down from all sides. The scattered documents rustled, though there was no wind. I turned sharply toward Holmes. "They cannot erase you." My own voice felt distant, hollow. "You are too well known, too remembered." Holmes regarded me with an unreadable expression. So was Henry Gifford. Once. A cold horror wrapped itself around my spine. Lestrade swore under his breath. "This is madness. We need to get out of here. Burn this place down. Salt the bloody earth." Holmes raised a hand for silence. Then calmly he turned to the shadowed corners of the room. "You misunderstand." The silence pressed in. Holmes' voice remained level. "You believe taking me will rectify the gap we have created, that by erasing me you will undo what has been done." He tilted his head slightly. "But you are mistaken." A pause. Then, "Explain." The whisper was cold, absent of inflection. It was the first time I had heard them speak without intent to command. Holmes smiled. "I am not a name written in a single archive. I am not an isolated fact, nor a stray thread in history." He stepped forward, completely unshaken. "I am 1,000 observations recorded in 1,000 ledgers. I am in the Times, in the Gazette, in every police report where a case was too clever for Scotland Yard to solve." He gestured toward me. "I am in Watson's journals, in every account he has ever published. I am whispered about in private clubs, cursed in criminal dens. Every thief in London mutters my name before committing a crime. Every constable speaks it before closing a case." His voice dropped to a whisper, but the force behind it did not waver. "You cannot erase me." Silence. Then the lamps flickered. Holmes did not move. "You have already lost," he said. "This moment, this conversation, has been recorded. 100 minds will record it. It will spread, whether you wish it or not." His smile sharpened. "And so, I ask you, if erasure is your only weapon, what happens when you fail?" For the first time, the presence wavered. I felt it in the shift of the air, in the way the shadows recoiled slightly, as though something ancient had faltered. Holmes stepped back beside me. His voice was softer now. "You cannot erase everything." Another long silence. Then, "This is not over." The weight lifted. The thick pressure in my skull snapped, like a great force retreating. The lamps steadied. The papers stopped rustling. The air was no longer heavy. I exhaled shakily, only now realizing how tightly I had been gripping the edge of the desk. Lestrade let out a shaky breath. "Holmes, tell me that means we won." Holmes adjusted his coat, expression unreadable. For now. I turned toward Henry Gifford, half expecting him to have disappeared. But he was still there, seated against the shelves, breathing heavily, his body racked with exhaustion. "Mr. Gifford," I said, kneeling beside him, "do you remember your name?" His bloodshot eyes met mine. A slow nod. "I do." Holmes offered his hand. "Then you will live." Gifford took it. We left Scotland Yard at dawn. The city remained as it always had been, alive, indifferent. The gas lamps flickered as the morning haze rolled in, the cobblestone streets glistening with the remnants of a late night rain. And yet something was different. Something had changed. Lestrade broke the silence first. "What happens now?" Holmes adjusted his coat and exhaled. "We continue forward, Inspector. That is all anyone can do." Lestrade rubbed his temple. "You know, Holmes, after this, I think I finally understand why people say you're mad." Holmes smiled. "Then I have taught you well." Lestrade let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Madness aside, I'll make sure Gifford is properly registered again. I'll put his name on every damn document I can find." "Good," Holmes said simply. Lestrade hesitated, then frowned. "And what about them?" Holmes' expression darkened slightly. "They will return." Lestrade muttered a curse. "That's what I was afraid of." "They are not gone," Holmes admitted, "but they have been seen. That is something they cannot erase." We parted ways with Lestrade at the yard, and Holmes and I continued back to Baker Street. We did not speak for a long time. As we stepped inside, Holmes moved immediately to his desk, withdrawing his journal. He flipped through the pages carefully, scanning every note he had made in the past 24 hours. His posture was rigid. I frowned. "Holmes." His fingers traced the paper. Then, in a quiet voice, he murmured, "I do not remember what name Gifford spoke." A cold weight settled in my stomach. I tried to recall it myself, tried to summon the syllables, the very sound of it. Nothing. Not even an echo. Holmes sighed, rubbing his temple. "They took it. That much they succeeded in." I shuddered. "Then does that mean?" Holmes turned to me, gaze sharp. "It means, Watson, that we must be careful." He closed the notebook. "And vigilant." I swallowed. "Do you think we will ever truly know who they are?" Holmes was silent for a long moment. Then quietly, "I hope not." I frowned. "Why?" He turned toward the window, watching as the city awakened. "Because, my dear Watson," he murmured, "I suspect that once we do." His voice trailed off. Then softer. "We may not remain to remember it." The morning light spilled through the glass, illuminating the fog beyond. And somewhere, just beyond the reach of memory, something watched. Waiting.